There is something about darkness that strips everything away. Not the soft, comfortable darkness of a bedroom with the curtains drawn, or the peaceful dark of a summer evening on a porch with the crickets singing. No. I mean the kind of darkness that comes without warning. The kind that swallows an entire city whole and leaves millions of people standing there in silence, looking at their hands, realizing in an instant just how thin the thread really is, the thread that holds everything together. The electricity. The water. The food. The sense of safety. The belief that tomorrow will look like today. Most of us have lived through a power cut at some point. Maybe the lights flickered during a storm and you lit a candle and waited it out. Maybe it lasted an hour. Maybe two. And maybe during those quiet hours, you felt something shift inside you, something old and primal stirring. A reminder that beneath all of our modern comfort and routine, we are still vulnerable creatures. Still dependent on systems that can break. Still subject to forces far larger than ourselves. Now imagine that feeling, and multiply it. Multiply it by days instead of hours. Multiply it by hunger and heat and fear. Multiply it by the sound of glass shattering on the street below your window. By the sight of flames climbing the side of a building you've called home your whole life. By the sound of gunshots echoing through dark alleyways where you used to play as a child. By the terrifying realization that the neighborhood you grew up in, the one you loved and trusted, has changed overnight into something unrecognizable and dangerous. That is what the stories you are about to hear are about. They are real accounts from real people, ordinary men and women who were simply going about the business of living when everything went dark. And what they experienced during those blackouts, the fear, the chaos, the heartbreak, the unexpected courage, changed them forever. It changed the way they saw their cities, their neighbors, their governments, their families, and themselves. Some of these stories come from corners of the world you may never have visited, from Brooklyn in the 1970s to a pharmacy in Caracas, from the hillside slums of Rio de Janeiro to a modest two-bedroom home in New Delhi. But I promise you this, no matter where you are from, no matter what language you grew up speaking or what streets you walked as a child, you will recognize something of yourself in these accounts. Because when the lights go out, we are all the same. We are all just people trying to protect the ones we love and find our way home. So settle in, friends. These are the stories of the blackout, and they are ones you will not forget for a long, long time. If you are new here and this is your first time joining us, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and come join our community. There are so many more stories just like these waiting for you, and you will not want to miss a single one. Story 1, The Night Brooklyn Burned, New York City, 1977. I grew up in Bushwick during the 1970s, and as a kid, that neighborhood was my entire world. Back then, everybody knew everybody. The streets were alive from morning to night with the sound of kids playing stickball in the road or jumping double dutch on the sidewalk, their laughter bouncing off the brick tenement walls. It was a neighborhood that was mostly Italian and Puerto Rican, with a handful of black and Cuban families scattered throughout. But by the time I was growing up, all those old tensions you might have heard about had mostly settled down. Kids of every color and background gathered at the corner bodega after school, trading stories and sharing candy bars and cold sodas, completely unbothered by any of the divisions the adults of earlier generations had worried about. And then I would run home to our apartment and be greeted by the most wonderful smell in the world, my grandmother's cooking drifting out through the open kitchen window, warm and rich and full of love. Life was genuinely good back then. It was simple, and it was whole, and it was ours. But I remember very clearly, around the time I was 10 going on 11, that something in the air began to shift. There was some kind of oil crisis happening over in the Middle East, and that mess rippled all the way across the ocean and squeezed the life out of a lot of ordinary working families in places like Bushwick. People's money started getting tighter. And then, when the Reinhold and F&M brewery shut down in 1976, it felt like a meteor had landed right in the middle of our neighborhood. People lost their jobs overnight. Stores that had been staples of the community for decades began pulling down their shutters for good. Friends of mine had to pack up and move off the block because their parents simply could not afford the rent anymore. It was heartbreaking to watch. Kids like me still held on to our dreams of making it big someday, still believed in something good waiting out there beyond those cracked sidewalks. But the cracks were getting harder to ignore. By the time I turned 13 in 1977, things had gotten genuinely rough, not just in Brooklyn, but across the whole city. Crime was creeping in slowly at first, and then with more confidence, like it had finally decided it had nothing to fear. I started waking up to sirens screaming outside the window on a regular basis. More and more good, decent people were leaving the neighborhood, and not always by choice. Some of them were being blockbusted right out of their apartments by shady real estate operators who showed up with envelopes of cash and persuasive smiles. And then, as if all of that were not enough, the son of Sam had started killing again. That deeply troubled man, who had already taken so many lives, went and shot 2 young people dead in their car out in Queens. And then, in what felt like pure evil, he wrote letters to the police and to the newspapers bragging about what he'd done. It made everyone sick with fear and rage. But me and my buddies stuck close together and kept looking out for one another, the way boys do when the world starts feeling unsafe. My very best friend in the whole world back then was this Puerto Rican kid named Oscar. He was everything a best friend should be, loyal, funny, a little bit reckless, and always there. Since it was summer break, Oscar and I were spending almost every waking hour together. The summer had started off warm and pleasant enough, but by July it had turned absolutely brutal. The thermometer hit 104 degrees in the shade, and that was no exaggeration. The so-called air conditioning in our apartment was just an old fan that did nothing but push the thick, muggy air around from one side of the room to the other. If you wanted any relief at all, you had to get outside and bust open a fire hydrant and stand in that rushing cold water until your whole body remembered what it felt like not to be melting. People were already wound tight from the Son of Sam headlines, and piling economic pressure on top of a heat wave that was robbing everyone of their sleep made the entire city feel like a pot getting ready to boil over. And then came Wednesday, July 13th. I was getting ready to walk home from Oscar's place that evening. His apartment actually had a proper air conditioner, which was a luxury beyond luxury that summer, so I'd been over there most of the day. Things were different back then, I should mention. My mom didn't worry the way parents worry now if their kids stayed out late. She worked afternoons and evenings, so she usually didn't even get home until 11, sometimes closer to midnight. And Oscar's dad worked the night shift, so he was already gone by 7:30. I usually left around 9:30 or 10, making sure I was home, washed up, and in bed by the time my mother walked through the door. But then, just as I was pulling myself up off Oscar's living room floor and getting ready to head out, the television clicked off. Every light in the apartment died at once. The whole place went completely black and silent. Oscar's first guess was that maybe his mom had forgotten to pay the electric bill. But when I crossed the room and looked out the window, I saw that it wasn't just their apartment. Every window up and down the block was dark. The streetlights were out. The bodega signs were out. The only light anywhere on that street was coming from the headlights of passing cars. And then it clicked for both of us at the same time. This wasn't a blown fuse. This was a blackout, a real one, a massive one, just like the famous one from the 1960s that the older folks always talked about. The entire city of New York had lost its electricity all at once. And honestly, at first, it felt kind of exciting. There was this strange, giddy energy to it, like something extraordinary was happening and we were right in the middle of it. Oscar dug out the small battery-powered radio his mom kept tucked away for emergencies just like this one, and once he found it, we tuned into WABC and listened to George Michael, not the singer, but a broadcaster by the same name, as he did his best to piece together what was going on. The station was running on backup generators, so they were able to stay on the air and relay important information. They advised everyone to switch off their appliances to reduce the load when power returned. They said not to use the telephone unless it was a true emergency since the lines were needed. Both airports had been shut down to prevent accidents in the dark, and certain highways had been closed as well. The message was clear: stay inside, stay calm, and wait it out. And looking back at it now, what happened in those first hours was almost sweet, in its way. It's hard to believe. But there was genuinely something like a block party atmosphere going on outside. Neighbors were pouring out of their apartments with flashlights, calling out to each other across stoops, asking if anyone knew what had happened. Cars pulled over and drivers rolled down their windows to join the conversation. Kids were running around waving their flashlights like wands, cutting bright arcs through the night, laughing at how strange and exciting everything felt. Once Oscar and I decided it was safe enough, we stepped outside ourselves to feel the night air and breathe in the energy of it. Even at that late hour, the heat was still hovering around 80 degrees, so being outside with all those people actually felt good. I had decided I would just stay put at Oscar's place, the way the radio said, rather than make the walk home in the dark. I was usually ready to fall asleep by 11, but that night as midnight approached, I was still wide awake, buzzing with all of it. The street had gradually grown quieter as the neighbors decided to take the radio's advice and try to get some sleep. Oscar and I were still lying on his living room floor with all the windows open and the radio murmuring softly in the background when we heard the first sound that made our blood run cold. A voice shouting somewhere down the block. And then the unmistakable crack and crash of breaking glass. We scrambled to the window and looked down. What we saw is something I have never fully been able to shake from my memory, even after all these decades. People were moving fast through the street below, their faces covered, carrying baseball bats and hammers and metal pipes. You couldn't get a clear look at them, not unless a car happened to roll past with its high beams blazing and lit everything up for a split second. But you could hear them perfectly. The shattering of storefront windows. The sound of shouts urging each other onward, come on, come on. Let's go. People were hauling furniture right out into the street. Whole armloads of clothes ripped from their hangers. We watched one group of men staggering past beneath the weight of enormous cuts of frozen meat they had ripped right out of the meat market on Broadway. It was pure, raw chaos, playing out right there below us. The sirens started up then and never really stopped. Police cars and fire trucks screaming through the streets from every direction, lights flashing through the dark. But no matter how many you heard, it never felt like enough. It felt like the entire infrastructure of order had simply been overwhelmed in a single night. And it wasn't only looters anymore. There were people out there who weren't even interested in stealing anything, they were just there to smash, to break, to burn, to release something that had been building up inside them for a long, long time. Watching it, I remember feeling genuinely frightened for the first time that night. Not the exciting frightened of the blackout itself, but a deeper, colder kind of scared. Because what I was watching looked like society itself unraveling right there on the street in front of me. And then one of the men below looked up. He caught us at the window, two teenage boys gawking down at him. He yelled something up at us, something about how we should have been in our beds, and then he hurled a glass bottle up at the window so hard that it only missed us by a couple of feet before shattering against the brickwork. After that, Oscar had had enough. He pulled us both back from the window and I could not blame him. The radio was saying the same thing: anyone in an area with active violence should move away from windows and stay as far inside as possible. But we couldn't just sit there in the dark doing nothing. So we did the only other thing we could think of: we climbed up to the roof. Standing on that rooftop and looking out over Brooklyn that night is a sight I will carry with me to my dying day. Flames licked up the sides of buildings all along Broadway. Other orange glows dotted the skyline in every direction, like bonfires spread across the whole borough. And the sounds that reached us up there, gunshots cracking through the distance, people screaming somewhere below, glass breaking in waves as store after store was hit, it sounded like the end of the world. And it looked like it, too. The looting went on for hours without any sign of letting up. I later heard that a single stretch of Broadway had been the hardest hit of all, 30 straight blocks of stores completely gutted, empty to the walls, many of them set on fire afterward. When Oscar and I finally came back downstairs, we lay down in his living room and tried to sleep, but between the sounds of ongoing chaos outside and the thick smell of smoke drifting through the open windows, sleep was impossible. The radio crackled with one grim report after another: looting on Myrtle Avenue, riots breaking out in Bed-Stuy. Police completely overwhelmed in both areas. The announcer's voice actually got louder and more strained as he described what was happening to the ANP on Broadway, how entire buildings were being set ablaze. Oscar asked me, quietly, if I thought the mob might work its way toward us. I shrugged and tried to sound like I wasn't worried. But my heart was thudding in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. By 2:30 in the morning, we had been smelling smoke for hours. But then something changed. What had been a distant, background smell suddenly became something much more immediate and alarming. The smoke was getting thicker, not drifting in from half a mile away, but feeling like it was right there, inside the building with us. And that's when someone started pounding on the apartment's front door. Not knocking, pounding. And through it came the sound of a voice screaming at the top of its lungs, "Fuego! Fuego! Fire!" The panic hit both of us like a physical blow. We ran for the door, yanked it open, and the hallway outside was already thick with black smoke hanging heavy in the air. Oscar and I made for the fire escape. The other residents of the building were already pouring into the hallway and onto the metal stairs, families in their pajamas, babies in arms, elderly neighbors moving as fast as their bodies would allow. One man on the first floor was half carrying his mother, who could barely walk, shouting at her to hold her breath, his voice joining the chorus of screaming infants and panicked neighbors all trying to move at once. I was terrified the fire escape itself would give out under the weight of all those people, that the metal would groan and buckle and send us all crashing down into the narrow alleyway below. But it held. It held through all of us. At one point, the whole line of people on the fire escape jammed to a stop as an elderly woman struggled to navigate the steps. A young mother just above her started to panic, convinced that her baby was breathing in too much smoke. And so someone made the call: we would pass the baby down the stairs, person to person, like a living bucket brigade. I remember the moment Oscar turned to me and held that baby out, and I felt my entire body go cold with the weight of what was being asked of me. I was so scared to take it. Scared to drop it. Scared to even breathe wrong. And Oscar looked me right in the eye and said, "Come on, man. Don't punk out." And I took that baby. Passed it safely into the arms of the person below me. And from above me came this little burst of relief and encouragement: "Attaboy, you did great. Now let's get it moving down there." And we did. We got moving. We made it down into the alley, all of us, gasping and coughing and leaning on one another. We stumbled out into the street, rounded the corner, and then turned to look back at the building. Flames were climbing up the rear of the structure, bright orange and furious, and even as we stood there watching, they punched through the front windows and began eating their way up toward the third floor, Oscar's floor. His family's floor. We stood there and watched as the kitchen curtains caught. As the living room window where we had spent so many afternoons after school went orange and brilliant with fire. Oscar stood very still and very quiet for what felt like a long time. And then, in a voice that sounded nothing like the confident, street-smart kid I'd grown up with, in a voice that sounded small and very young, he said, "Everything's in there." Eventually, a fire truck arrived and trained its hoses on the building. But we all knew it was already too late for much of it. People drank cold water straight from a cracked hydrant like it was something precious, and slapped each other on the back with this desperate relief, this sense of having survived something that could have gone so differently. And we were lucky, genuinely, deeply lucky to have gotten out of that building before it was fully consumed. But the expression on Oscar's face as he watched the flames swallow his childhood home, I have never been able to shake that image. Not in all the years since. If something in this story is touching your heart right now, or if you've ever lived through a night that changed everything, share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. When morning finally came, the power was still out and the summer sun rose to reveal the full extent of what had happened overnight. The streets of Bushwick looked like something out of a disaster film. Glass blanketed every sidewalk. Storefront after storefront stood burned and gutted, their insides hollowed out and blackened. Smoke still curled lazily upward from spots that had only stopped burning a short while before. Police were out in force now, and what I believe were National Guard troops as well, moving through the streets in the brittle quiet of the aftermath. People tried to hold themselves together, but you could see the devastation on their faces. Some of them had lost their homes. Some had lost their livelihoods. All of them had lost something. Oscar and I walked all the way back to my apartment after the fire, and my mother nearly fell apart when she saw us at the door. She had heard about the violence on Oscar's block and spent the night terrified that I'd been caught in it. We slept for a few hours and then she walked us back to find Oscar's parents. The walk toward Broadway was something I can still feel in my bones. It was like moving through a wound. Glass crunching underfoot. The smell of wet ash hanging in the heavy air. The husks of burned-out buildings on either side like broken teeth. And everywhere, that stunned, hollow look on people's faces. Oscar found his parents eventually, and the moment they laid eyes on him, they broke down in tears, relief so overwhelming it barely fit in a human body. They held each other on that street corner, in the middle of all that wreckage, and just held on. But the block was gone. It turned out that some fool down the street had set a car on fire during the chaos, and the flames had jumped from the car to a trash pile sitting up against the side of the building. And an old tenement like Oscar's, baked dry by weeks of that brutal heat, needed almost no encouragement to burn. The fire had done the rest. The lights came back on late the following night. But Bushwick was never the same after that. Something had broken in those hours of darkness, something fundamental and fragile, and it could not simply be switched back on like a light. As a 13-year-old, that was as frightening as it was confusing. But I suppose that is life. You roll with the punches. And if you are skating on thin ice, my friend, you might as well learn to dance while you're at it. Story 2, The Pharmacy on the Corner, Caracas, Venezuela, 2019. My name is Mariana, and although I live in Argentina these days, I grew up in Venezuela during the 2000s and I carry that place inside me every single day. My family lived in a district of Caracas, a crowded, noisy, vibrant part of the city where the buildings were packed close together and everyone knew what their neighbor was cooking for dinner just from the smells drifting through the open windows. It was loud, yes. It was cramped. But it was also full of an incredible passion for life, full of laughter and music and the kind of food that people cook when they genuinely love the people they are feeding. My father ran a small pharmacy right on the corner of our street, and although I was too young to fully understand it at the time, that pharmacy was the beating heart of our entire neighborhood. My father knew everyone, and I mean that literally, because everyone came to him eventually. Every young mother carrying a newborn on her hip, every grandmother making her slow and careful way down the sidewalk, every construction worker with a sore knee, every schoolteacher with a migraine, they all passed through my father's door. He knew their names and their children's names and their medical histories and their stories. He knew which families were struggling to get by and which kids were having a hard time at school. He gave his best advice freely and without judgment. He stocked the things people needed most. And when a family couldn't afford to pay right away, he quietly extended credit and said nothing more about it. He was a quiet man, a deeply kind man, always in his white coat, always smelling faintly of antiseptic and peppermint candies, the little ones he kept in a jar by the register and slipped to us children when no one was looking. Being his daughter meant I spent many of my after-school afternoons in that pharmacy, sitting on the counter doing homework or watching him work, learning without realizing I was learning what it meant to truly serve a community. On Sundays, when the pharmacy opened late and closed early, my father would take the whole family to the beach. Those afternoons at Playa El Agua or Xixaribish were something sacred, coolers packed with cheese and avocado sandwiches, cousins splashing and shrieking in the warm water, the sun sinking low and painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful to be real. Music was everywhere. Life was good. There was a sense of possibility in the air, a feeling that the country itself was alive with energy and potential, even if things were not always perfect. But underneath all of that warmth and beauty, the ground was shifting. Around the time of my 14th birthday, the government under Maduro began changing the country's energy policies in ways that squeezed ordinary people harder and harder. And then inflation came, not slowly, not gently, but like a wave crashing into a house of cards. Prices that had been manageable one week doubled the next. The value of the bolivar melted away so fast that my parents had to rethink every single purchase. It felt like an invisible thief moving through our lives, taking a little more each time. I heard my parents argue at the dinner table for the first time ever. My mother had to line up for hours in the early morning just to secure basic food items, flour, cooking oil, milk, things that should have required no more than a short trip to the bodega. Poverty began creeping into the neighborhood like a slow tide. Crime climbed with it. There were protests in the streets, and those protests turned violent. There were deaths. And my father, for the first time since I could remember, stopped looking excited at the end of his workday. He started coming home exhausted, his face tight with worry, telling us stories of patients who had come in for medication they desperately needed but simply could not afford. Getting certain medicines became a daily battle as government regulations made importing anything increasingly difficult and expensive. He never stopped helping, slipping free samples to families in need, staying open late when someone had an emergency, but the weight of it was changing him, slowly and unmistakably. And then came March 7, 2019. It was late afternoon, just around 5 o'clock, when the lights went out. But this was not like the ordinary power cuts we were used to. Those happened all the time, a flicker, a few hours of darkness, and then everything humming back to life. This was different from the very first moment. The power went out across all of Venezuela at once, from Caracas, our home, all the way to the smallest village in the most remote part of the country. Everything went dark together. By around 9 o'clock that evening, with still no power restored, the government broadcast a message over the radio. Those of us with battery-powered radios huddled around them and listened as officials announced that the blackout had been caused by a CIA sabotage attack on the Guri Dam, a massive hydroelectric facility that powers most of the country. They blamed the United States military. They made it sound like an act of war. Nobody believed them. Not for a second. We all understood what had really happened. The power grid had failed the same way everything else in Venezuela was failing, through years of neglect, zero maintenance, corruption eating away at the infrastructure from the inside until there was nothing left to hold it together. The system had simply collapsed under its own decay. The news reports that followed over those first dark hours were frightening in ways I had not been prepared for. The hospitals were the worst of it. Most of them could only afford to keep enough fuel on hand to run their generators for a handful of hours at a time. When that fuel ran out, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Newborns and incubators were at risk. Surgeries stopped mid-procedure. Medical staff were forced to carry patients out to the parking lot and hook machines up to car batteries, actual car batteries, just to keep people alive. People were furious, and rightfully so. They demonstrated the following day, demanding the government act. Riot police were sent in. Officials promised the power would return within 24 hours. It was a lie. Another one in a long line of lies. Over the days that followed, the situation deteriorated steadily. Food rotted in refrigerators. The water pump stopped working, leaving families without running water. The metro shut down. In the mornings and afternoons, streets that were normally navigated by buses and taxis became rivers of people on foot, walking miles to work and miles home again in the blistering heat. What should have been a brief emergency stretched into a nightmare that lasted a full week for some parts of the country. And then came the looting. By the third day, people in harder-hit areas had reached the point of genuine desperation. I heard reports of crowds, hundreds of people, storming shopping districts in places like Maracaibo, sweeping through supermarkets and bakeries and even hardware stores. They were not only looking for food. People were grabbing furniture, electronics, anything that could be traded later for the essentials that others were hoarding and selling at extortionate prices. Families guarded their homes with whatever they had on hand: sticks, machetes, hammers, iron bars. Whatever it took. Here in Caracas, it was not as extreme as what was happening in other cities. But still, on Avenida San Martín, groups were breaking into shops under the cover of darkness, smashing windows and grabbing what they could before police arrived with tear gas. Gunshots echoed through the streets at night. Families like mine pulled shut the heavy metal concertina gates on their homes and shopfronts and prayed that the violence would not find its way to their block. For the most part, it did not. But then, on the fourth day, something terrible happened. Something that made everything else feel small by comparison. Our pharmacy occupied the ground floor of our building, with our family's apartment directly above it, the two connected by a smooth stone staircase inside. My father had always known that a pharmacy stocked with medicines, many of them extremely valuable on the black market, was a potential target. But in all the years he had run it, through all the difficulties Venezuela had thrown at us, not once had anyone broken in. Not once had anything been stolen. We had never needed to think about it seriously. But when my father received word through the neighborhood that a local gang was planning to target a store, it confirmed for him what he had been quietly suspecting, that things had changed in ways that could no longer be wished away. Still, he did not panic. He did not despair. He simply began to prepare. He knew better than to rely on the police, who were focused on protecting wealthier districts and government facilities, places with food stockpiles and clean water that needed to be defended for political reasons. The gangs knew this too. So my father operated on the assumption that whatever protection he needed, he would have to provide himself. He had heard the gang might strike on the third night of the blackout, when hunger and desperation would be at their most acute. But the third night passed without incident. And then, deep into the fourth night, at around midnight, it happened. We were all jolted awake by the sound of something heavy and insistent striking the metal shutters of the pharmacy downstairs. 5 or 6 men, working in the dark, methodically trying to force their way in. My father said later that these were probably rough, desperate men from the barrios, people robbing not out of some organized criminal enterprise, but out of a brutal and urgent need. But knowing that did not change what had to be done. My father did not panic. He had laid his plans days in advance, and now he moved through them with a quiet, deliberate calm that I found both terrifying and deeply reassuring. He put on his shoes, picked up the thick steel plate he had salvaged from an old construction site, the one he had welded heavy straps to so it could be used as a makeshift shield, and carried it to the landing of the stairs. From there, he had a clear line of sight all the way through the pharmacy to the metal shutters, through the large diamond-shaped gaps in the barrier, and he could see the men working at the lock. He planted the steel plate in front of him, crouched behind it, and gave them their one warning: leave now, while you still can. Their response came back loud and contemptuous. They told him to go back upstairs and mind his own business. If he stayed, they would hurt him. And my father answered them in Spanish, in just 3 words: so be it. He moved the shield down the remaining stairs and positioned himself behind the pharmacy counter, where he reached for something he had prepared and stored carefully in advance. In the back room of the pharmacy, using only things available over the counter, he had assembled a homemade tear gas device, a glass jar filled with a mixture of ammonia from cleaning supplies, chili powder for additional burn, and a splash of vinegar to create a reactive, choking gas. Attached to the jar was a fuse salvaged from some leftover fireworks we had kept from a celebration long past. As the men outside hammered relentlessly at the lock on the shutters, my father lit the fuse, held it while it burned down just enough, and then pitched the jar across the length of the pharmacy toward the shutters. The explosion was sharp and contained, and the gas that erupted from it engulfed the robbers in a thick, suffocating cloud. They erupted into coughing and cursing, their eyes streaming, some of them staggering backward. A few retreated immediately, wanting no more of it. But others, tougher, or perhaps more desperate, held their ground. And then one of them raised a weapon and fired directly at my father. The bullet struck the thick steel plate and bounced away. A second shot followed. It, too, struck the shield and deflected harmlessly. But my father knew that a shield could only absorb so much punishment before the structural integrity of the metal was compromised. So he began backing up toward the stairs, withdrawing to the next phase of his plan. Upstairs, my mother and I had locked ourselves in the bedroom, listening to everything through the floor and the walls. We had already agreed that if the men got past my father and started up toward us, we would go out the back window. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Below us, we heard the sounds of the robbers finally forcing the shutter open and flooding into the pharmacy. And then, their laughter. The almost giddy sounds of men who believed they had won. Who began pulling medicines from the shelves and stuffing them into bags. Painkillers, antibiotics, anything with value. They cleaned the shelves with practiced efficiency. And when they were done, they still were not satisfied. They spotted the staircase. And they began to climb. What they did not know, what they could not see in the darkness, was what my father had done to those stairs after retreating upstairs and setting down his steel shield. He had covered every single smooth stone step with cooking oil. And then, for good measure, he had scattered broken glass over the oil. The first man hit the first step and went down. His scream was something I will never forget, a triple scream, almost, one on top of another, the shock of the fall, the shock of the pain, and then the terrible realization of what he had fallen onto. The man behind him tried to push past and promptly suffered the same fate, his feet sliding out and sending him crashing down into his companion. And then the rest of them, trying to retreat, came down the stairs in a tangled, screaming pile, slipping and tumbling and cutting themselves on the glass that had been waiting for them in the dark. They left the building with deep lacerations on their hands and their arms and their legs, bleeding and moaning and leaving trails of blood across the pharmacy floor as they stumbled out into the street. My mother had known exactly what was happening from the moment the screaming started. That is why she was calm, squeezing my hand and telling me in a quiet, steady voice that everything was all right. My father looked down the stairs afterward and saw the wreckage of what had happened, and he told us later that he felt no triumph. How could he? He knew how close things had come to going irreparably wrong. But they were alive. We were all alive. And the robbers were gone. Like this video if stories like this one move you, and share it with the people in your life, because these are the kinds of accounts that deserve to be heard and remembered. The pharmacy in the aftermath was heartbreaking. Shelves stripped bare. Broken glass across the floor. Blood stains on the stone tiles that took days of scrubbing to fully remove. Everything that had been precious and hard to obtain, the imported medications, the specialty items that cost a fortune to bring in, gone. And beyond the physical damage, my father was now genuinely afraid that the men would return, angrier this time and looking for revenge. He said he slept with one eye open for the days that followed, never fully letting his guard down, never allowing himself to relax. Our neighbors came the next morning, bringing what food they could spare before it spoiled any further, helping to board up the broken door. The whole community knew what had happened and what my father had done, and the reaction was one of deep respect and shaken relief, because everyone also understood what could have happened if things had gone differently. We rationed our remaining candles and batteries. We boiled river water to make it safe to drink. We waded through the smell of rotting garbage in the streets. The trash trucks could not operate without power, and we counted the hours. On the 14th of March, the power began to return to Caracas. It was inconsistent at first, flickering back to some neighborhoods while others remained dark. But gradually, over the following hours, it spread, back to the towns and the villages, back to the apartments and the pharmacies and the hospitals. People celebrated in the streets as if a war had ended. They cheered and embraced and wept with relief, many of them not yet knowing that there would be another major blackout at the end of that same month, and another one in July. But when those came, the community was ready. Neighbors formed a human chain around the block, standing shoulder to shoulder through the night to protect the pharmacy and the people inside it. It was one of the most moving things I have ever witnessed, this spontaneous, unorganized act of love and solidarity. But for my father, it was too late to change his mind about what had to be done. He loved those neighbors. He loved that community. He did not feel that they had failed him. But those 3 blackouts, stacked one on top of another, had shown him in the clearest possible terms how fragile the country had become, and how utterly indifferent its leaders were to the suffering of ordinary people. Those experiences changed my father. They changed me, too. So when he announced, without much preamble, that we were leaving Venezuela, and that we would leave in the middle of the night to avoid having our belongings confiscated for the crime of trying to emigrate, neither my mother nor I raised a single objection. And so we left. And as I said at the beginning, Argentina has been our home ever since. I miss Venezuela with an ache that lives somewhere deep in my chest, a permanent tenderness. But I know with absolute certainty that we will not return until the day that country's people finally get the leadership they have always deserved. Story 3, The Favela in the Dark, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 1999. Growing up in Rio made for a wild and unforgettable childhood. I was born and raised in Babylonia, which sits up on the hillside overlooking a neighborhood called Leme. Leme is a wealthy place, full of sleek apartment buildings and the kind of boutique shops that sell things most of my neighbors would never in their lives be able to afford. Babylonia is a favela, which, roughly translated, means a slum, a ghetto, an informal settlement built by people who needed a place to live and had to create it with whatever they had. The rich lived down there below us, in their mansions and their luxury apartments, looking up at the hills. We lived up here on the steep, stacked hillsides, in homes that fit together like pieces of a colorful, crowded puzzle. They did not look up to us in any sense that mattered. And though we could literally look down on them from our height, we understood very well that in every other way, looking down was all we could do. We were poor people. But we were rich in spirit, and I mean that without a shred of irony. Football was the center of our lives, and yes, I know how that sounds, like something scripted, something cliched. But I am telling you the absolute truth. Whether it was organized matches on the bright concrete pitches or the casual games that kids would play under flickering streetlights at night, chasing each other and laughing, football was woven into every part of life in Babylonia. It made us happy. And because it made us happy, happiness itself was everywhere. The favela felt alive in a way that is very difficult to describe to someone who has not lived it, this constant, pulsing energy, this sense of joy that could, on the right evening, feel bright enough to light up the whole city below. But let me be honest with you, because these are honest stories. Life in a favela has 2 completely different faces, and it is not possible to tell this story truthfully without acknowledging both of them. During the daylight hours, the politicians and the police were in charge, and people went about their business, working, shopping, sending their children to school, in the ordinary, familiar rhythms of daily life. But after sunset, the calculus changed. The police rarely came up to the favela after dark. The politicians were safely at home in their comfortable houses in other parts of the city. And in that vacuum, the gangs moved in and took charge. On bad nights, gunfire would pop off like fireworks across the hillside. And it was not only a nighttime problem. If the police launched a raid on a gang hideout during the day, entire streets could be locked down for hours while officers and gang members traded fire from opposite ends of an alley. Sometimes those standoffs only ended when somebody died. A gang member. A policeman. An innocent person who had simply been in the wrong place. You learn things early in the favela. You learn to keep your head down and trust your instincts. You learned which neighborhoods were safe and which were not, and you learned never to cross certain invisible lines after sunset. But even with all of that knowledge, even with all of that care, trouble had a way of finding you in the favela no matter how hard you tried to stay out of its path. And there is no better example of that in my own life than the blackout of March 11, 1999, a date I will remember until I am old and gray and the memories of everything else have faded. I was 14 years old, going on 15. It was a Thursday night, as ordinary and quiet as a Thursday night in the favela ever got. I was at home looking after my little brother while my mother was visiting a friend nearby. And then, without any warning whatsoever, all the power went out. I found out later that it had been triggered by a single lightning bolt striking a major electrical substation in Bauru. But that one strike had tripped a cascade of circuit failures that spread across the grid like a line of falling dominoes. Generator after generator shut down. Even the massive Itaipu Dam, one of the largest hydroelectric structures in the world, could not hold the system together. In an instant, the entire southern part of Brazil went dark. São Paulo. Rio de Janeiro. All of it. At exactly 10:16 in the evening, everything went black. I went upstairs and out onto our small balcony and looked over the city. Every building was dark. Every streetlight was out. The roads were the only things with any light, the headlights of cars moving slowly and cautiously through intersections where the traffic signals had died. The whole enormous city, spread out below the favela, was reduced to this strange, silent darkness broken only by moving beams of light. It was an astonishing thing to see. Frightening and beautiful at the same time. People called out to each other from their windows. Candles began to appear, flickering points of warm light showing up in window after window across the favela, so that the whole hillside looked like it was full of tiny stars. Generator engines coughed to life here and there, because power cuts happened often enough in Babylonia that many families had them for exactly this kind of situation. And at first, the mood was uncertain but not alarmed. Blackouts happened. They usually lasted a few hours at most. People assumed this would be the same. But this one was different. And as the minutes stretched into an hour and then beyond, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to tighten. Whenever something disruptive happened, a blackout, a police operation, anything that broke the normal routine, the police generally sent patrol cars through the favela to show a presence and keep things calm. But that night, a full hour passed and I did not see a single police vehicle anywhere near us. From what I could tell, looking down at the city below, all the police activity was concentrated downtown or around Botafogo, near the high-end commercial districts where the fashion shops and electronics stores were. The gangs noticed this just as quickly as the residents did. Some people had portable radios and were listening to what was happening across the city. The news coming in was alarming: looting, violence, widespread chaos in multiple neighborhoods. And people began to worry about what would happen if the gangs in the favela decided the unguarded darkness was an opportunity. I was scared. I was 14 years old and I was genuinely scared. And so I made the decision that I have spent many years since both forgiving myself for and regretting. I left my little brother alone in our bedroom and went looking for my mother. The streets when I stepped out were not what I had expected. At first, they had a strange, almost festive quality. People were gathered in groups by flashlight, laughing and sharing drinks, music playing from battery-powered speakers, dancing by candlelight in doorways. It felt less like a crisis and more like an impromptu carnival that nobody had planned. There was no looting, no violence, just people making the best of an unusual night. And I found that reassuring. Reassuring enough that I kept walking toward my mother's friend's house without feeling too afraid. But by the time I got there, the atmosphere in the favela had shifted completely. It happened fast, faster than I would have thought possible. The gangs had heard through their own channels that all the police were tied up downtown protecting commercial areas. Rival crews who had been watching each other for weeks, waiting, calculating, suddenly saw their window. No police meant no consequences. And so they came together and started planning. I had barely been reunited with my mother for 5 minutes before the first shots rang out. She had already been angry with me for leaving my little brother alone, and she was in the middle of telling me we were going straight home when the sound of the gunfire froze us both in place. The first bang, and then another, and then the realization that these were not firecrackers, they were too sharp, too deliberate, too close. She told me we had to stay put. That it was not safe to go back out there. But I could not stop thinking about my little brother. He was 8 years old, alone in a dark apartment, and now there were gunshots echoing through the neighborhood. The guilt was unbearable. And so, with the kind of impulsive, desperate logic that only a frightened child operates on, I ran. I bolted out the door and back into the night. What I saw during that run is something that has never left me. Automatic weapons firing in long, chattering bursts, the muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness in strobe-like pulses. The sound of bullets ricocheting off the concrete walls of buildings, producing this sharp, layered echo that seemed to come from every direction at once. I saw groups of young men charging through alleyways, firing wildly, dropping to the ground or scattering when they ran into a rival group at close range. Sparks flew where bullets struck metal rooftops. Women screamed. Children cried. People who had been dancing in the streets an hour before were now pressed flat against walls or sprinting with their heads down, trying to get back inside before a stray bullet found them. I recognized a boy from school, an older boy, not a gang member, just a regular kid who had been out, and I saw him running for cover when a burst of gunfire caught him from behind and he went down. I did not stop. I could not stop. I saw two rival groups meeting at a street corner, using overturned cars as cover, firing at each other from close range with rifles. I threw myself behind a wall as bullets struck the concrete next to me, sending chips flying. The air smelled of gunpowder. The flashing of the weapons cast wild, jagged shadows. It felt like a real war, and I was running through the middle of it, a 14-year-old kid in a t-shirt and sneakers, thinking of nothing but his little brother. And then someone called out to me from a doorway. A man, standing in his open door, beckoning me inside, offering shelter. I hesitated for only a second. I was convinced that another few steps in the open would be the end of me. So I ran to him, and he closed the door behind us. At first, he seemed calm and kind. He said he had seen me around the favela, that he knew my family. He gave me water. He put a hand on my shoulder, as if to comfort me. But then the hand stayed there too long. And when I tried gently to move away, his grip tightened. He pulled me closer. His other hand began to move. And he whispered that I should relax, that I should stay. I should be clear, I am a man, and at this time, I was a boy. This was the absolute last thing I had anticipated from this situation. And when I understood with absolute certainty what his intentions were, something broke loose inside me, a burst of raw, desperate energy, and I shoved him as hard as I could, threw open the door, and ran back out into the night. This time with tears streaming down my face. This time not thinking about bullets or crossfire or any of it. Just running. Blind and sobbing and weaving through whatever chaos was happening around me, past gunfights and falling bodies and the sounds of people screaming, until I finally burst through the door of my own home. I ran upstairs. And there he was, my little brother, huddled under his blanket in the dark, having cried so long and so hard that he had gone silent again, that exhausted quiet that comes after a child has used up every tear. I pulled him into my arms and held on. And we cried together. And he kept asking me, in this tiny, confused voice, "Where did you go? Where did you go?" And all I could say, over and over, was, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." That night stayed with me. It will stay with me for the rest of my life. And if there is one lesson buried in all of that chaos and fear and heartbreak, it is this: in times of crisis, the children need us most. The little ones especially. Because the world is terrifying enough when you understand it. For a child in the dark, in every sense, it is something else entirely. Story 4, The Roof in the Blackout, New Delhi, India, 2012. My name is Priya, and I live in America now. But I grew up in New Delhi, in a slum, and as the name suggests, life there was not easy. Our home was a modest two-bedroom dwelling that I shared with my parents and my younger brother, Arjun. My father earned his living as a rickshaw puller, a job that had bent his spine and worn down his joints after years of hauling passengers through some of the most relentless traffic in the world. By the time I was a teenager, he suffered from chronic, severe back pain that he simply pushed through every single day, because stopping was not an option. My mother worked in a garment workshop with dim lighting and poor ventilation, stitching clothing for a few hundred rupees a week, enough to contribute to the household, not enough to change our circumstances. When times were difficult, they were genuinely, deeply difficult. My least favorite season growing up was the monsoon, because the rains would push water right through the gaps in our walls and up through the floor, flooding the rooms and forcing us to sleep on rough wooden pallets to keep off the wet ground. It was uncomfortable and humiliating in a way that a child feels very keenly, even without the words to express it. But there were joys, real and vivid ones, that kept my spirit alive during those years. India is a country of celebrations, and some of my warmest memories are of Diwali, the lanterns, the sweets shared with neighbors, the whole street alive with light and sound and the feeling that something magical was possible. And there was Independence Day with the great kite battles that filled the sky, rival kites swooping and slicing at each other's strings while the people flying them cheered and cursed and laughed at the outcomes. We ate rice and dal most days and power cuts were so frequent that they had become something of a running joke in the neighborhood, the electricity here today and gone tomorrow, undependable as ever. We laughed about it. We had to. But then came the power cut that I will never laugh about. The one that, even now, all these years and thousands of miles away, still sends a chill through me whenever I let myself think about it. It was 2012, and I was still a student, though I also worked part-time at a local garment factory, a different one from my mother's. And it was around this time that a boy named Rajesh entered my life, though entered is far too gentle a word for what he actually did. He was the son of a factory supervisor, older than me, arrogant in the way of a boy who has always had just enough power to believe he deserves more. He wore his hair slicked back and a gold chain around his neck, and he carried himself as though he occupied a different category of person than the rest of us. His family's apartment was on the edge of the slum, not middle class exactly, but elevated enough that the gap between his world and mine felt enormous. One evening after work, he cornered me. He was grinning, which I already did not like. He asked if I had any plans to get married. When I said no, he told me he wanted to meet my father, by which he meant he intended to arrange a marriage between us. When I declined to set up that meeting, his expression changed. The grin dropped away. He did not shout, but the anger was right there under the surface, cold and controlled and more frightening for being contained. He told me to reconsider. I told him to leave me alone. He stood there, rigid with fury, and told me again to reconsider. I told him that if he continued to approach me like this, I would go to his own father and describe exactly what he was doing. He told me I would regret my decision. Then he walked away, shaking with the effort of containing himself. That was June. And then, just over a month later, on a night in late July, the lights went out. It was around 9 in the evening. The power had been unstable for days, as it often was in the summer heat, and when the lights finally stuttered and died completely, at first it seemed like just another ordinary cut. The street lamps went dark. The fans in our home went still. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the low, cautious murmur of neighbors wondering how long it would last this time. My parents were still at their evening shifts, so it was just me and Arjun at home. He was 10 years old, quietly playing with his toy cars in the glow of our one emergency lantern, perfectly content. I was in the kitchen boiling water for tea when I heard a knock at the front door. I called for whoever it was to come in. And the person who entered was the brother of a school friend, a boy I recognized, and he was breathing hard, clearly having run to reach us. And the words he had for me turned my blood cold. Rajesh and several of his friends were on their way to our house right now, at this very moment. My friend's brother had been close enough to hear them talking, had understood from their own words what they intended to do to me. And he had sprinted to warn us before they arrived. He had saved my life. I want to be very clear about that. What happened next would have been different, and almost certainly far worse, if he had not run to us when he did. I grabbed Arjun. I snuffed out the emergency lantern so that no light showed through the windows. And then we ran upstairs to our bedroom and pushed the heavy wooden dresser we shared in front of the door to barricade it. We sat in the dark and the silence, pressed together, listening. We did not have to wait long. Within minutes, we heard someone kicking the front door open downstairs. Rajesh's voice, unmistakable, shouting at the others to find me. I heard them spread out through the ground floor, pulling open doors, moving furniture, looking in every corner. There were at least 4 of them from the sounds of it, maybe more. It was not long before they found the stairs. I heard Rajesh calling my name. Taunting me. Telling me that our little barricade would not protect us, that I should come out, that he was going to teach me what happened to girls who refused him. Arjun was trembling beside me on the floor, holding a small kitchen knife he had snatched on the way upstairs. I pressed my finger to my lips to keep him quiet, but every creak of the floorboards outside the bedroom door made it harder to stay still. They began checking the rooms one by one. I could see the beams of their flashlights sliding through the cracks around the door, sweeping closer. And I realized that the moment they found our room, the dresser against the door would not hold for more than a few seconds. The window was open. It had been open already, which meant no risk of the sound of it being pried up alerting them to our movement. I lifted Arjun through first, as quietly and carefully as I could manage, and then I climbed out after him, scraping my knees raw on the windowsill as I pulled myself through. We were on the flat stone roof of the ground floor, just outside our bedroom window. I directed Arjun, silently, with gestures and whispers, to climb up to the roof of the bedroom itself, to get up and out of the line of sight of the window, and to lie flat. Seconds after we had pressed ourselves down against the rough stone surface of that roof, we heard the dresser scrape across the floor as they shoved the bedroom door open. Someone shouted that I had been in here. Several of them ran to the window. We did not move. We did not breathe any louder than we could help. I could hear them leaning out, talking, looking around at the darkness below. And then Rajesh asked the question that I will remember for as long as I live, his voice irritated and confused, "Where is she hiding?" We lay there in the dark, completely flat, completely silent, as the seconds expanded into what felt like hours. My mind ran through every possible outcome. I made myself stay still. I made myself breathe slowly. And I held Arjun's hand in the dark. And then, and I cannot describe the relief of that moment without feeling it all over again, I heard Rajesh say, "She must be hiding somewhere outside." And they ran off, clattering back down the stairs and out into the neighborhood to search for me. We did not move. We stayed exactly where we were, on that rooftop in the dark, until we heard the sound that finally told us it was safe, our mother's voice, coming from downstairs, screaming at the sight of her ransacked home. We climbed down to her and fell into her arms, sobbing as we told her what had happened. The power did not return to all the affected areas for 2 full days. My father went to the police when it did, and through the investigations that followed, 2 of the men who had broken into our home were identified and arrested. They turned out to be small-time criminals with records who had been recognized by neighbors who had seen them kicking our door down. Under questioning, they admitted they had been hired for what they described as essentially a scare job. But they refused to name the person who had paid them. Which meant Rajesh walked away untouched. I saw him in the neighborhood a few days later, swaggering along like nothing had happened, a smug half-smile on his face. And strangely, unexpectedly, that turned out to be the only advantage we ever got from him. His pride would not allow him to acknowledge failure in any form. He had tried twice to exert his power over me and had failed twice, and the last thing he wanted was for anyone to know about either of those failures. So he let it go. He left me alone. What happened was horrifying. It was traumatic in ways that I did not fully understand until much later in life. But something else came out of that terrible night, something that I hold close. Arjun and I became closer after it than we had ever been before. I was so profoundly proud of that 10-year-old boy, the quiet steadiness of him on that rooftop, the small kitchen knife clutched in his hand, the way he trusted me and stayed still when staying still was the hardest thing in the world. I wanted to be worthy of that trust for the rest of my life. Our paths took us to different places as we grew older, and I carried the distance between us every day. But I sent him money every month without fail, to make sure that he and his children have a life that is a little better than the one we started with. Because he was there for me on that rooftop. And I intend to be there for him, in whatever way I can, for as long as I live. Thank you so much for spending this time with these 4 extraordinary stories. Each one of them is a reminder of something essential, that when the world goes dark around us, it is the people we love who become our light. And that ordinary people, when pushed to their very limits, are capable of a courage that takes your breath away. If any of these stories touched something in your heart today, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you have a story of your own, a moment when the lights went out and everything changed, please share it with us in the comments. We would genuinely love to hear from you. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. There are so many more accounts just like these waiting to be told, and we'll be back soon with more. Until then, take care of the people around you. That has always been, and will always be, the most important thing.